yes. So then you could ask, of course, the next question would be, okay, if you are in a school kitchen or in a school where children are eating, and they're eating many types of food, and they're actually in that environment every day. So that environment will not be like an anticipation of going to a restaurant with a certain kind of visual, three-dimensional surrounding context thing going on. But you would be always going back to the same room, the same room, the same room. But you would also eat a lot of different types of foods. So in terms of the visuals or the physical surroundings, what do you think would be important in a space for children to eat in? What's important?
So one thing that that anthropologists are really, really interested in relationship to food that oftentimes I think gets neglected is the extent to which our experiences of food are mediated by our social relations, right? So that whatever makes me have an experience of a pleasurable meal has a lot to do with what I'm literally tasting, but it also has to do with who's in the room with me and what kind of experiences I'm having. And one thing that's really fascinating about the way, as we've moved towards more and more feeding people outside of the home in a small sort of domestic environment, and we increasingly ask people to consume their food in environments that are intensely social, but the social relations are not necessarily clearly related to food, is that a lot of what happens, for example, in schools for children around lunch has to do with feeling anxiety about who they're going to sit with because there's no order. There's somehow this idea that it's like, just go get your food and sit down at a table and eat your food, and that's all just somehow has nothing to do with the fear you have that you're going to be sitting next to the bully or whatever that is. So I'm always fascinated with the sort of lack of attention that is spent on the actual means by which you not only get your food, but then who you sit with and why you sit with who you do.
It's much more
in
important.
Cafeterias for children, I think when children tell the story of eating in schools, it's always not about the food, it's about all of this stuff about where they were going to sit. So anyway, that's something I'm interested in.
There's a French school lunches are very different from American school lunches, and there is a program in Philadelphia now that where essentially French or Italian school lunches are served in schools, and one of the arrangements is that there are 8 children sitting around the table. They sit for a whole half hour, which is very different from the usual case where after 5 minutes they're throwing food. And also they always sit with the same people. So it changes the entire environment. Also, they have no food choice, by the way. They get 3 courses, and if you don't eat it, fine, but that's it. And it changes the whole structure of the experience. It's much quieter and more conversational.
You said something about the way the respect of food in France was so high and it was a natural thing that children should get the same respect for food. You could say that they were actually being served cutlery of real, well, not silver perhaps, but good quality cutlery rather than plastic, because that's part of the whole.
Yes, in this particular program, the plates are not paper, they're ceramic, and the silverware is metal. It's silverware, as it were. And it's a little difficult to manage these things in a culture which doesn't expect that. It's a challenge. But in the French school lunch, all of this is true, but also many children go home for lunch if they live near from school, because lunch is an hour or an hour and a half. Ours is a much shorter lunch. So the whole experience of eating is much more conversational, much more social, more discussion of the food than we typically have. We are often watching television during the game. So we're talking about attention and anticipation. What's going to be on TV while you're watching food can become a matter of contention in a family.
It does make you feel like serving them anything, like, okay, it does take the interest off of serving somebody, if they're not paying attention to whatever you serve. It's just about nutrition, filling your mouth. So all this context about being respectful about food is really important, and it will rub off on anything around you, the way you sit, the way you frame your dining room. in Denmark in the old days, for everybody in the countryside, they had no money and they were very poor. So they were having, but they all insisted on having this beautiful dining room, and it was taking up 35% or 45% of the space they were having for the whole family. And they would rather have that room sitting there with plastic all over it, when plastic was invented eventually, just covering it up with cloth or whatever, so that those 5 occasions during the year where they had people coming over, they could keep up, what is it, the social status or something. Yeah. So that was interesting. I mean, that was so important. That was a driving force to have that space, that architecture around you, and with all the trimmings and everything to show off kind of thing, because it was important for a social rise and fall.
See, for many Americans, food is fuel. It's just getting the calories in. So they're doing an accessory activity. It's sort of like going to a gas station. We don't think about putting the gas in the car right while we're filling up the car, and we're not particularly concerned with the architecture of the gas station. But a meal is a much more scripted, potentially social. People don't normally put gas in with somebody else, for example. We just have to do it. It's like breathing. And you can treat food that way, and that decontextualizes it, makes it much less meaningful.
Yes.
Yeah. I also, just one other thing that I think, I don't know if this is the case in Denmark or any of the countries where people are from other than the United States, but one thing that's happened, if you think about schools and the feeding of children in schools, is the space in which children are eating are understood as multifunctional spaces. So what happens is all the tables and chairs and all the things that might signal that this is a place where you eat have to be able to be taken up and moved out so that you can use the space for something else at another time. And so I think that's also one of the reasons why the whole experience of the actual context for eating the food in an American school is just sort of empty, or sort of, it has so little contextual meaning because it's been stripped because of the very idea of what those spaces are for.
But
they're
to
not
me that also
primarily
says
for food.
they're not taking the children's lunch seriously. They should be funding the designated space for dinner or for lunch. I mean, of course. And now you're saying that they were preoccupied with the social interaction rather than the food or whatever.
Yeah.
So if I ask you, does the aesthetics of that school dining room matter much? Is it important? I mean, what would you answer? Would you say, well, doesn't matter really, they'll eat in a basement if you like. It's about other things. Of course, I would say it matters because I know a lot about how daylight, for example, daylight is very important to children at any stage. You actually have some surveys showing that if the children who are sitting next to the windows in the classroom, they're scoring higher marks than their peers in the back of the room. So, of course, as a parent, when you know that, you gotta ask, my little baby's gonna sit next to the window. But that's really, really important. So daylight, for instance, as a natural quality of the aesthetics of a space would be important in our framework. But if you have a multi-functional use for a school dining room, and you have to clear out the room to make gymnastics or whatever, then you're really disrespecting that very important moment when they have lunch.
I've been looking for a new condo in Philadelphia, and I've been irritated by the fact that almost all of them have open kitchens. So the kitchen is sort of part of the living room. And there's a big living room. The living room has windows, and the kitchen is off in one corner. And I sort of like a contained kitchen. But then I discovered an architectural fact that the city requires that a kitchen have windows. So in order to get around that problem, they make the kitchen part of the living room, which has windows. But then, of course, they've destroyed the eating space, because most of these places don't have a separate dining room, so you can eat in the kitchen. And they've taken a shortcut to.
Well, actually, it's a little bit more like, when we are bundling up in cities and there is a migration towards the city, which is an urbanization, generally speaking, we have smaller spaces to live in and we have less time together. So what we're doing is we are overlapping all functions, and really the only time the family is together is around the meal. So they are sitting in the room, and mom is not in a separate room, or dad cooking, but with the family, because the time you're spending cooking is a valuable time. And so you're in the living room, in the kitchen, everything is all one room, and you have the telly on and whatever, and however you choose to do it. But that's part of that trend about downscaling in size. You know, IKEA has known it for years. You're showing you the one catalog after the other with all the book containers on the walls and all the cupboard spaces, because they know that we live in tiny spaces, most of us. So actually the Scandinavians are some of the people who are spending most space. I think the Swedes have the world record of 56 square meters per person, where the Danes only spend 52, but the Indians, they spend 2.9 square meter per person for living space. So that is really awesome, really incredible. So you can see the resources we're spending on space for living is also under pressure and is also in development. You should think the Americans, they are living
We have
large,
a lot of space,
but they're not.
But the dining
you have
room
a small
is an option. It would be an essential, but when you're cutting down space, you need the 2 bedrooms. If you and the kids, you got to have a kitchen, someplace to entertain the living room, and the dining room is what often goes in these places.
Yeah, but it's overlapping because the time is scarce and the functionalities have to work together. Once you're in the family, you do everything at once. So that's the modern urban life.
One thing I'd say, and I know that this is going to come up this afternoon, talking about commensality, but when you talk about, you know, let's say a multifunctional space and what you do in a multifunctional space, which increasingly, even in our homes now, food operates in multifunctional spaces. They're not like a discrete closed kitchen and a discrete dining room, at least in the United States. And in other cultures, there's never been the concept of a dining room at all. And even a kitchen was, you know, the idea of a separate space was kind of odd, or it wasn't actually physically in another building because of fear of fire and things.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to what Paul said about the table, that everybody sits at the same table with the same 8 children. I mean, as somebody who's interested in sensory and taste education, I don't really know if I care so much if the physical space is a beautiful space, but the proximate space, it seems to me, needs to be something that has been paid attention to, so that the table that you sit down is, the same table for the same kids, or the table that you sit down is not just some terrible piece of plastic and you have rickety, uncomfortable chairs, or I don't know. That seems to me, I think that makes a difference in what that then leads the people to do in terms of their paying attention to the sensory experience of food.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I think so too.
And if everybody's eating different things, which is happening more and more in the United States, one of the kids likes macaroni and cheese, so you put that in the microwave. One of the other kids likes peanut butter. So when you're not eating the same thing, there's first of all a temporal change. You know, everything isn't ready at the same time. You don't have a common subject to discuss, the food. And sometimes people go off and watch television during their eating. So the whole commensal part of it is affected by both the architecture and, frankly, the microwave, which has made it easy to make everyone's food special for them.